here to talk about this very important topic. Did you know that telemarketing scams often target the elderly? 2004 report showed that seniors are more likely to report fraud, and an AARP study of a lottery scam found that 71% of the victims were 75 or older, and 65% of the victims of the lottery-based phone scam were women with incomes under $30,000. So obviously the perpetrators out there, they know who to target, and they're very good at it. And in this day and age of technology, they're getting even better. The strongest predictor is if a victim has been victimized before. So a victim often is victimized a second time, and a phone-based scam most often targets male senior citizens in the higher income brackets. 80% of victims are men who earn more than $75,000. So that means they know who you are, they know what you make, and they're actually out there looking for you and targeting you. There's certain characteristics they look for in elderly victims. Sales calls give social contact, so they look for the socially isolated. They look for that contact, and they're unable to seek advice from someone else because of the isolation. But they also look for social activity because there's more exposure to situations where they could come in contact with these individuals. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of elderly victims. And just kind of a little background. I'm kind of giving you guys some information up front, and then I'm going to give you some tips on how to avoid either you or a loved one being a victim. And then we're going to talk about some of the different situations and scenarios that arise and the statutes in Missouri that address those situations. So, first of all, the first characteristic of an elderly victim would be someone who has a lack of financial knowledge and experience. Maybe they had a deceased spouse who handled the finances. They're reluctant to admit that they're not sure about how to handle their own finances. Maybe they paid too little attention to their finances, so they don't know that this money has been taken from them. They have an over-dependence on a caregiver or an advisor. Now that's usually one person, not multiple, but one person who gives them care, and they're less likely to report the abuse or exploitation, and the likelihood of abuse and exploitation by one caregiver increases. Another characteristic is the adult is overly trusting or charitable. So they target those people, too much independence. They can be vulnerable to fraud. Who would think independence would be a bad thing? But some seniors fear that asking for advice indicates weakness or an inability to handle their own affairs. So they don't talk to their friends or family members about what's going on and who's approaching them and what kind of information they've been getting. They may have anxiety about financial or health status. They may have an inability to hang up on telemarketers. Sometimes you just need to hang up the phone, and they may not be able to do that. Part of that may be the social isolation, that they enjoy talking to someone else. Then we go on to unreported fraud. So why don't 80% of elderly victims report fraud? 80% don't report it. Number one, they blame themselves. Number two, shame. They're embarrassed. Number three, they fear separation. Maybe they fear that they would be put into a nursing home because of it. The economic, physical, or psychological dependence on the abuser. Now that's a close friend or a family member or a caregiver, and we're going to talk more about that later. They're intimidated by the criminal justice system. A lot of people have questions about the criminal justice system because outside of it, you don't understand what's going on in it. And so they're intimidated by it and by talking to the police. They may fear physical harm from their abuser, so they may feel that that person might harm them, or they may fear that no one will believe them. But what's important about reporting the fraud, reporting their exploitation, is number one, it provides the victim closure. So it says to them, they did the right thing, they're not alone, that this person or persons had taken advantage of them. It takes the perpetrator off the streets, and it protects others from the exact same scams, the exact same exploitation, and it also gives the possibility of restitution. So if a loved one had $50,000 drained from them by a caregiver who, by the means of fraud, it gives them the opportunity to ask the court to have that person repay the money to them. So those are important. It's important to keep in mind the impact on the victims. So they experience significant trauma as a result of these life-changing events, and often victims die within 9 to 12 months of the crime. They feel very personally violated. It's traumatic for them. They lose trust in themselves. They lose trust in others, and they suffer further isolation from their friends and family members. And then, of course, there's the loss of the life savings if that happened. If they lost their life savings during this, they suffer from the anxiety that comes from that, the comfortable retirement, access to services, medical care, insurance. A victim on a fixed income has to have that for their necessities. Now, keep in mind the trauma response if they suffer, it's similar to grief. So they go through the same stages: shock, anger, guilt, shame, depression. All of those things could happen, and those are all the stages that they could go through. They feel helpless, they have fear and feel helpless. They're confused, they blame themselves. So how do we persuade the victims, the seniors, to report the fraud when they feel all these things? They're going through all of these the emotions and the events. So educating the public and senior citizens reduces victims' response to telemarketing by half. So the #1 way to do it is to educate seniors on how they can prevent it, but also how they can overcome it. What does not work? In order to persuade somebody to call the police, scare tactics isn't going to work. Any approach that makes them feel foolish for being scammed is not going to work. They feel hurt or guilty, and they'll be less likely to participate in a discussion about it on how to avoid future scams if they feel that way. So the best way to approach them to convince them is to show empathy for their situation. Obviously, they didn't know that they were going to end up in that situation, or that the person was going to take advantage of them. And it's easy to be in that situation and also discuss the specifics with them. A lot of times talking about what happened, makes them feel better, puts them at ease, helps them then communicate with another person that is a stranger, like a police officer or a prosecutor who needs to know the facts of the situation. But do not preach to them, because preaching to them is, again, going to make them feel guilty about what happened. So empathy is really the best way to go, and I know everyone here knows that. So, concrete coping strategies, just kind of guide them on that. As far as telemarketers go, hang up, how they can get on the no-call list, if there's certain, how they can ask the telemarketer to take their information down, they'll call them back. That way they can verify if it's someone they actually need to be talking to. So moving on from what the victims are, now we need to know what to look for when we go to the perpetrators, okay? So there's 2 basic types of perpetrators, people who target these individuals. You have #1, dysfunctional people with low self-esteem. And #2, those who methodically target vulnerable seniors. And those are the most dangerous people, because they're the ones that know what they're looking for, how to look for it, where to find the info, how to get it. If the perpetrator is a stranger, #1, most are male. Stranger perps are often male. They're charismatic, they're controlling, they seek first to build the victim's trust, and they use promises whenever possible. They overpromise. They promise things they never follow through with, that they never follow up on, they never give, and they resort to threats and intimidation if necessary. So keep an eye out for those types of characteristics involved in any of your loved ones' lives in any way, I guess, elderly or not. They're seldom violent, but they don't have a conscience. I mean, obviously they're targeting people for a reason, for their own self-gain, not in a legal way. They're not bound by conventional norms or ethics. They don't have a conscience in that regard either, and they rationalize their behaviors being okay. So that's if the perpetrator is a stranger, along with they suffer from psychological dysfunctions. They may be motivated by a need to feel powerful, to feel power over the victim in order to get them to do what they want them to do. And they often carry out their fraud without ever meeting the victim. So those are the people that either the victim met online or over the phone and have never even met in person. If the perpetrator is a friend, relative, or caregiver. So here's a statistic for you. Over 60% of scammers of the elderly are family members. 60%. So more often than not, it is your family. 60% are male. Offenders are significantly younger than their victims. So 40% are 40 or younger. 40% are ages 41 to 59. That's the perpetrators. And the offenders usually fall into 3 categories. They're adult children, grandchildren, or other relatives. They are professional caregivers, or they are close friends or others in a position of trust. So those are the 3 different categories. Their relationship to the victim is what allows them to carry out or gain the access to the documents, to the financial information that they need to carry out the scam. And they often need the victim's direct participation in order to do so. Their signature, their banking account numbers, putting them on accounts, giving them access to the information in order for them to do it. Prosecution is often hindered because of the victim's reluctance to prosecute a family member. And often these perpetrators know that because they know grandma or Aunt May won't prosecute them. So they're more likely to target those people. But 2/3 of all financial crimes are perpetrated by someone known to the victim. So elderly or not, 2/3 are relative, family member, close friend, caregiver. So what are some warning signs? What are some things for you to look for if you are concerned about this or to protect yourself? Number 1, look for any unusual activity on bank accounts, where you have a situation with numerous withdrawals from ATMs, overdrawn accounts, maxed out credit cards. So that's going to be one of your first indicators. Look for if the caregiver is trying to socially isolate the victim so that the victim comes to the point where he or she is solely dependent on the caregiver. Any new acquaintances that arrive on the scene and they express gushy, undying love for the older adult. The older adult is either completely charmed or in fear of the caregiver. And sometimes it's one or the other, and sometimes it can be both, depending on where the victim is in their mental state. So look for if the adult is living well below his or her means and complains of not having enough food, money, heat, or is poorly dressed. Personal belongings such as jewelry, antiques, silverware come up missing from your family member, friend. Driver's license, social security numbers missing, social security card, any sensitive documents that come up missing unexplainably, that's a sign. If the victim suddenly gives a power of attorney to someone who did not have it previously, there's been no discussion about it, a caregiver, or any other legal documents, maybe a will is written, sale of the property or signed, when it's apparent that the older adult is incapable of understanding those documents and what his or her signature means on the documents and the legal effect of their signature on them. Let's look for the caregiver or other person as a position of trust, promises lifelong care in return for the change in the adult's will, for changing it, or deeding the house over to them. So if a promise such as that is sought by a caregiver, that's usually indicative of them committing fraud. If the adult is engaging in legal or financial matters with no comprehension as to what was done or why it was done. So if you have a family member who is telling you about, certain legal documents that are being signed, but they have no ability to explain to you why they did it or how come, other than so-and-so told me to. My home health nurse told me I needed to sign this or I needed to do this. because that's usually a sign that they're being led in the wrong direction. Family member with no previous interest in adult's well-being moves in to help care for the adult, but has no independent source of income and is living on the adult's resources. So that might be a signal to you that that person is looking for, it may potentially exploit that adult, the older adult. Other warning signs are numerous unpaid bills. Look for utilities, rent, house deed, anything that is supposed to be paid with the older adult's money and is not being paid all of a sudden. If eviction notices arrive when the adult thought they owned the house, obviously that is not a good thing. If the house was sold out from under them and they had no knowledge because they did not realize that what they had signed was a quitclaim deed. Adults receive lots of mail for contests, free trips, sweepstakes. If the adult gets frequent calls from strangers offering great deals or asking for charitable contributions, those two things, what that means is maybe they've gotten on a list, whether it's through the telemarketing or through the mail, that scammers look for and target. So if they have a lot of those, they look for those people and then they target them in order to engage more with the victim because they assume that they will be more likely to be able to engage them. And the same with magazines, it's the same situation where they're looking for those people who are buying the magazines in order to subscribe, you know, publisher's house, you know, where you're supposed to, you buy the magazines and then you win the big check where they come to your door, right? So the reason for that is because the adults, they believe and they target them because the adult is looking to win the lottery. So they think they're likely to engage them in what would either be a pyramid scheme or some sort of scheme where they're going to take the person's money, possibly in return for a big lottery payout or a big check arriving at their door. So that's why they target those lists, and they can buy those lists in order to get those names. So here are the tips in order to minimize your risk or a family member's risk. So start out, have a plan. Have a plan for yourself, for your family member. Sit down with your attorney and your family members, develop a plan for your future care needs. So when you're still able to and your mind's still kicking around and nobody's taking advantage of you yet, include a power of attorney and a living will. So that's going to prevent that from happening because you're going to have someone that's there for you, that's looking out for you, and you've got it in writing early on so that there's also an attorney that's involved that knows what your wishes are at a time when you're able to express them very fully. Those that don't prepare for the future are the ones that are preyed upon by individuals who are able to get them to sign things later on when no one's around paying attention to what's being signed, what property is being transferred. So the best way to do that is to create a team of advisors. So have 3 or 4 people you trust completely. And this team advises you on important legal and financial decisions. So that can involve your parents, your siblings, your children, your cousins, your best friends, your neighbors, your attorney, whoever you want it to be. And then set up and make sure that no one person other than yourself has total control of your finances. Always get at least 2 to 3 other opinions from your team of advisors for any change in investments, assets, or insurance. So that way, you know, not one person is trying to influence you, but instead you have a range of opinions that can give you advice when you're seeking it. Have a power of attorney. So have a power of attorney prepared by your attorney. When considering the power of attorney, it's not always the best to have a general power of attorney. You might want to do a limited one when able. I'm sure Vaughn can tell you more about that than I can when it comes to that, but it's definitely a good idea because you have somebody out there looking out for your best interest, and therefore you're less likely to be preyed upon. Be aware. So remember that the person you trust the most is the person in the best position to steal from you. Now, sitting here right now, you may not think a family or relative member would ever do that to you, and I can completely understand that. And they may not, and hopefully they won't. But just understand that given the position of trust they're in, it's possible, and all you're doing is protecting yourself, your family, your loved ones from that happening in the future. And and then also keep valuable, sensitive information locked up at all times. That's something that is really easy to say, but for sometimes hard to do. And I'll give you an example. I did a presentation on identity theft, and I was giving out all these tips on how to avoid it. And one of the ways is don't carry around like 5 or 6 credit cards in your wallet. Don't carry around your social security card. And then the other day I opened my wallet and they were all in there. I was like, well, guess I hope I don't lose my wallet, right? Because my identity's stolen right there because I have all those credit cards, my checkbook, and my social security card was in there. So it's easy to say to do that. It's hard to do. So when I got home that night, I opened my little lockbox that I have at home that has a little combination, and I stuck my social security card in there and everything but one credit card. Because really, do you ever need more than one credit card? Well, sometimes. But I put them all in there so then it minimizes your risk if you lose your wallet or somebody steals it from you. View your statements. So one of the things to keep track of, and I know we've had this this weekend, there was a scammer issue down here in St. Francis County where people got their bank account information stolen. I don't know where. I'm not sure if they've determined yet exactly where the scammer was, but clearly they got the information on the individual's credit cards and they were able to take money from their accounts. And so view your statements, because if that happened, that's the best way for you to know it happened. And if you have money so that you're not looking at it all the time to check to see what your balance is, you may not know that you've had $200, $20, $50 taken out of your account. And the timing of that is what's important on getting it back, because the longer the time goes by, depending on the financial institution, is how much they give back. But that's a topic for another day. But view your statements. And even if you have an advisor who manages your finances, just always insist on receiving copies of those bank and financial statements. Because even if that financial advisor is a trusted friend, it's always better to have 2 eyes, because if they know you're looking, they're less likely to be doing anything that they want you to see, right? Safeguard your accounts. Now, don't allow anyone else's name on your account, because once you take Sally or Joe with you to the bank and put their name on your account, you have now given them authority to take everything out of that account that they want. Now, there may be situations where that's a good idea, and again, if you trust that person, but once you put their name on that account, they are able to take money from that account just as if it's their own, even if they're not putting any money on it, because that's what the bank allows and that's what the law allows. So just keep that in mind before you add anyone else's name to your checking account. Join the no-call list. I don't know how useful it is anymore. I don't get any calls, but if you have that, you know, there's the Missouri no-call list, and I think there's a national one too. So that's also a way to minimize the information, your phone number getting out there. And this one's obvious. Again, don't give out your personal information to strangers, even if they contact you. And that's come up recently with a lot of people are getting the IRS phone calls, like, hi, this is the IRS, we've issued a warrant for your arrest, please give us your social security number right now, or they're on their way to your door. And, you know, to most of us, we think that's ridiculous, but it has scared quite a few people over the years. I mean, like, they really think something, and it's a scary phone call. So it's you know, easy to keep in mind, but then in the heat of the moment, sometimes you wonder, is this real? You get emails that look like Discover Card, hey, we need your account number, or this has happened. Well, those aren't real, because Discover Card would tell you they never send those out. So just be wary that anything asking for your personal information usually is a scam. If a caller asks for your age, your physical condition, whether you live alone, giving any of that information out may identify you as a good target for a scam. Finally, a lot of times Facebook, in this day and age, people will put information on Facebook that scammers will target in order to identify whether or not you are a potential victim. And also, even everyone else, when you post like, hey, I'm in Mexico right now, then they know you're out of town. They would break in your house. I don't know if that's that much prevalent down here, but did you have a question, Vaughn?
Actually, this is a Facebook question.
Sure.
If an elderly family member who's in their right mind is being financially exploited by a family member and they choose to knowingly give their money to them, is there anything legally that can be done? Is this a crime?
It's not a crime. It is definitely not a crime, because what the question is saying, the questioner is saying to me, is that the person's competent, that they're able to make decisions that they believe is right, and the questioner may disagree with, but they're able to do it because they haven't been found legally incompetent. So no, it's not a crime. It may be a civil situation that I don't speak to, but it's not a crime in Missouri.
And there are other questions that have come.
Okay.
Whenever you have time.
No, go ahead. I've made it through all my characteristics, and then I was moving on to your various situations that you presented me to talk about too.
Yeah, there were questions that were asked in the past, and civil attorneys don't always have the answer. So here's another one. Sometimes I hear about restitution being ordered after a conviction for stealing from the elderly, but after a year or two of small payments, the court may decide to stop making the person pay. Can you speak to this? Does this actually happen?
So what will happen is if somebody is placed on probation, and let's say they're placed on 5 years of probation, they could be ordered to pay any amount of restitution that the victim can prove. So we'll get a case, and let's say you had $50,000 stolen from you. We would require the documentation to show the $50,000. You give us your checking account information, not like the accounts or anything. That's what I'm advising you not to do. But you would give us the information that would show that it was stolen. The person would plead guilty, and we would ask the court to make a condition of the probation to repay the restitution. Now, this day and age, what we have to do is to say they have to pay a minimum monthly amount. So $50,000, you probably should pay quite a bit a month, but if a defense attorney says, my client can't pay that much a month, they say, well, $100 a month minimum. So as long as they're paying that $100 a month minimum, then they cannot be revoked from probation. At the end of their probation, which is probably what your questioner is asking about, is can they be discharged from probation if the entire amount of money is not paid in full? Yes, they can, and here's why. Because debtor prisons were outlawed in the United States a long time ago, and if that is the only condition of probation, then it's possible the judge could say, we will discharge the person from probation, refer the restitution to collections. Now, does that mean you'll see any money as a victim? No, it doesn't, as you know. So at this point, at the end of somebody's probation, the only thing to argue is they didn't pay restitution. It's frowned upon by the Supreme Court and everyone else to revoke them simply for the fact that they hadn't paid a debt. It can be a condition of revocation, though, if they were ordered to pay a certain amount and they hadn't been, and then they were also violating other conditions. So we're looking at ways to at least light a fire in that situation where there's somebody's on probation and they haven't been paying. They have been ordered to, so they can be brought before the judge so the judge can inquire as to why they're not paying, and to say to them, you could be revoked off of probation. So get your stuff together, start paying, here's what you have to pay. So at this point in time, people could actually be ordered to pay restitution even if they're sentenced to prison time. So that can happen. It's just a matter of collecting after they get out. They're on parole, they have to pay. Again, it's ideal that they pay, and hopefully, and a lot of people are paying, and they pay us at our office, and the office distributes it to the victims. But if they don't, sometimes the remedies are civil actions in the end. Still had a question?
Yes. Can a lien be put on their assets in connection with them paying back restitution?
Not in a criminal's case, but you can always seek civil counsel. So in that same situation, if somebody stole from you, there could be a civil claim that you could go and use You could hire a civil attorney to file an action on your behalf, get a settlement or a judgment for that, and then take action that way. If it's somebody with means that has a house or something that you could put a judgment or a lien or a garnishment against, you know, but not in a civil case, or excuse me, in a criminal case. In a criminal case, we're left with restitution that can be ordered on probation and following a conviction and sent to prison. It's just, the collection is not as easy for us as is in a civil case.
I want to ask this one because it's come in more than once. Can you speak about the situation where someone is deathly ill and they don't want to go to a nursing home and they're determined to check out in their own way and they're letting the family members know? Can anybody go to jail for saying nothing or doing nothing and allowing it to happen?
Yes. Yes. In Missouri, there's criminal negligent homicide, which is actually called involuntary manslaughter, which means that if you are a caregiver or in a position where you're supposed to give care to somebody and you do not do so, and I don't have the statute in front of me, so I hate giving legal terms, but essentially you fail to provide the care that is required, then yes, you could be investigated and potentially charged with recklessness or criminally negligent involuntary manslaughter is what the term is called. Now, everything's on a case-by-case basis, but yes, absolutely. Okay.
Could it be specified in the living will that you want to die in your own home? If you were given that type of prediction from a doctor?
Well, yes, it can. And maybe I misunderstood why, because I think you were kind of saying like the caregivers that are like, we're not going to give you your medicine so you die.
Or the caregiver says, go shopping, go spend the day with the rest of the family, leave the gun right here by the bed, or the narcotics right here by the bed, just leave the whole bottle.
Right. Yeah, so that's two different situations. So, essentially, is it assisted suicide? There's an argument both ways for it. Every case is different, but if there's a situation where you have evidence, testimony, or witnesses that would say that somebody who is in a position and legally should have rendered care to the person and failed to do so in a criminally negligent manner, that they could be charged. So,
what if it's the kids? They come to visit dad and they know this is about to happen because this is what dad has wanted and this is what he said he wanted. They don't live there, so they don't take care of him. They're just visiting, but they know it's happening.
They know that
dad has always wanted to be able to check out when he got so sick that it was just a quality of life issue.
Well, again, the issue comes to, you're asking me about like assisted suicide, where somebody does something to assist another. So,
well, what I'm talking about is now, let's say my dad has, Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's getting worse and worse, and he's been talking about it, and he's always said, when I get to the point to where I don't want to do this anymore, I'm just going to eat a bullet. And I know this. And I come to visit him and he's at his lowest point ever, and then I just, say, Dad, I love you and all this other stuff, and then I leave thinking this is the day he's going to do it.
Gotcha.
What happens to me?
Yeah, essentially, that is not a good way to go about things. Ideally, you would seek legal counsel in order to get guardianship over your dad, who obviously is suffering from side effects of his situation, and therefore you need someone else to be in control of dad's situation, whether it's placing him, getting assistance. The problem that I have with answering this question is every criminal case is different. So if you're asking me for legal advice for that kid, I can't give that.
I don't think this kid wants to, but this is a sort of conversation that in my office, we hear people say it, and sometimes they're just riffing and being funny, but a lot of times they are deadly serious, and I know of at least one case where it actually did happen, where it was known that it was gonna happen, but
So, I mean, the law has very specific things that we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
okay.
So, was that person in a position where they were required, legally mandated to provide care for, and chose not to do so? Or was that person basically turning a blind eye to what would otherwise be a risk? So when you think of criminally negligent homicide, I mean, the number one, if you looked up case law on it, it's going to be drunk driving. You knew the risk, you disregarded it. You got into the car, behind the wheel, you drove 90 miles an hour with a .01 BAC, and you killed your buddy in the front seat. You are going to be charged with involuntary manslaughter because you disregarded the risk when you got in the car. Or actually, in that situation, it could be reckless. Because you drove so fast. But let's say you didn't drive fast, but you were drunk, and then someone else hit you. You didn't know how to respond because you were legally drunk, and your friend died. So you disregarded the risk, and somebody ended up dead. There, you're the driver. You're legally responsible because you chose to get behind the wheel. If the person is legally responsible for that person's care and disregards the risk, and we have evidence or testimony to it, yes, they could be held responsible for involuntary manslaughter. That is correct. And I think I finally understood the question.
Okay.
Does that clear it up?
That does.
Okay.
Can I take you to the one that I get a lot? The one I think I submitted the question to you earlier, Satana.
Satana.
Yes.
I figured Satana was like a take on Satan.
So.
Yes, so Satana. I missed her?
No, I think it's a typical scenario. It starts with dad's not himself. I can go right to it.
Oh, go right to it, yeah.
Okay, so this comes in a lot,
Okay.
in many, many forms, but it's essentially this, and it could be a man or a woman, but in this particular case, dad's not himself, especially when he's around his live-in girlfriend, who we call Satana. He's acting like a little kid, always buying her fancy cars and fancy trips and jewelry and designer clothes, and he's burning through our inheritance like it's nothing. So the final straw was when Satana talked him into putting a $120,000 addition on the house just because she wanted a sunroom. Dad is now broke, and we absolutely hate this woman. So when Dad had a stroke, we snuck over when Satana was out shopping, and maybe we kidnapped him a little bit. But it was for his own good. We put him in a nursing home, which we never wanted, but what else could we do? And then we filed for guardianship and threw Satana out on the street where she belongs, and now she's screaming bloody murder and saying we stole her house. And she's just generally playing the victim card. Is she just whining, or did we do something wrong?
Well, so to me, you had a judge who said you did something right because he or she granted the guardianship. And actually, I had this situation come up where I was guardian ad litem, that it was a mother who was taken out of a nursing home in Texas and brought here to Farmington. Yes, Texas was very upset about it and threatened to charge him with parental kidnapping. It never happened. It's not ideal. It is certainly not the ideal situation. Here in your example, since they filed for guardianship, the judge basically got to speak on the issue, granted the guardianship, and allowed them to continue on, and now they get to protect Dad's interest. So Satana can cry and why all she wants, but her lawyer can deal with that in court on the guardianship, or file an appeal on her behalf, or a motion to set aside the guardianship if she feels like it was wrongly. But that's a civil matter. That's not going to be a criminal in the sense that nobody reported it to the police that he was kidnapped. So we become involved as prosecutors when the police are notified, and then the police are the ones who bring us the reports. So a lot of times, and you know more than any, we get these calls and emails and Facebook messages from people who were victimized, but they haven't contacted the police. So our first thing to them is, we're not an investigating agency. We need to hear from the police, so call the police. Is that my phone? I was like, what? So oftentimes in that situation, number one, police. first. And we always encourage them to reach out, file a report. They'll get a hold of us if they have any questions, and we go from there.
I want to bring this one up because
Sure.
this is a new one that we hear a lot about. My mom, who has dementia, has a ton of family photos on her internet cloud storage account. Because I know her password, I got into it to download those pictures so that I could frame them for her nursing home room. My evil brother is the guardian. His lawyer says I committed a crime. Is he crazy?
Yeah. Yeah. I would have to do some research on that, but no crime comes to mind.
Okay. Perfect. Now,
Just
paid,
pictures off Facebook.
do you get
Well,
paid
no.
extra to give her all of these confidential
No.
conclusions here? She's setting you up
No,
for.
these are questions.
these are actual questions from actual people. So, speak to the issue of using mom's password to access mom's accounts without mom's permission, whether that be bank accounts or cloud accounts, you know, any of those things, online banking in particular. You know, you're not named on the checkbook, you're not named on the account, but mom needs her bills paid. So you log in or you sign the checks even though you're not on the account because the utilities need to stay on while mom's at the hospital or mom's in a nursing home recovering. Without a power of attorney. Let's assume there's no power of attorney.
Okay. Now again, let me point out to you that what you're talking about, who's going to report him to the police?
It's almost always going to be a sibling who doesn't like it.
Okay. So then if we have a police report on it, then it is, did mom consent? Did mom have knowledge? Did the person get any financial benefit out of it themselves? Or did their actions only benefit mom?
Okay. So what if they did something that was technically illegal but did not benefit them? They were doing it for all the right reasons, it was just straight up illegal.
Well, okay, so in order to charge a crime, every crime has elements to it. Some crimes have 5 elements, some crimes have 2, some have 3. In order to charge that crime, we have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each and every element of that crime. Stealing, for example, in order to prove stealing, we have to prove each and every element of the crime. So one of the elements in the crime of stealing is with the intent to deprive the person thereof. So if your intent is not to deprive mom of the money, but to assist mom, no, ideally, you should not be doing it. But the remedy is not going to be in the criminal justice system. The remedy is going to be with the sibling contacting an attorney in order to hash that out as far as with probate court and whether or not mom needs a guardian or somebody appointed in order to take care of their financial affairs or a power of attorney if mom's not able to sign, or a guardianship if the mom's incapacitated, or a power of attorney if she's not.
Okay. Well, here's another, is this a crime question? And actually, I want to know this because this happened to me. So, my mother was lonely. The only person she saw every day in her neighborhood was her home health aide. She got really close with her, and she started choosing sides. The home health aide became like a daughter to her. This is my late mother, so if she's not watching this and getting ready to send me an evil message, okay? Okay. She starts treating the home health aide like a daughter, and one day mom and the aide drive over to the local bank, and the aide gets added to mom's bank account. Is this legal?
Does mom have capacity? Is mom
Yes.
able to consent?
Yes.
Then no.
Okay.
If mom is in her right mind and can consent to that, mom can add anyone she wants to it. If prior to that happening, a power of attorney came into effect or there was a guardianship, then no, it would not be. If mom is not able to consent, has been declared unable to consent to have capacity by a doctor, then no. But if mom chooses to, for whatever reason, even if you don't agree with it, it is not a crime.
Okay. And just to wrap this story, because the whole point of these questions is this a crime or is it just frustrating? In this particular case, I went to the local police chief and had a chat with him, and he contacted the Home Health Aides Agency, which has a strict rule against home health aides taking advantage of people like that.
Right.
So she got fired and reported to the registration agency after the police chief made her go get her name off the bank account. No crime committed, but he was kind enough to help fix the problem, and then we got a guardianship right after that.
Right.
But it wasn't a crime, he just helped out of the kindness of his heart.
And that's why we talk about these and how to prevent them up front, because they're so hard to prove on the back end. Because even if the person, even if mom's and dad's still able to consent, you might know in your heart of hearts that this isn't right because you're a friend or a family member, but if they're still able to consent, a crime doesn't occur. And in a lot of situations, when it comes to the criminal part of financial exploitation of the elderly, you have to be able to prove that the person was unable to consent at the time that the person was talked into giving the money or giving the house or whatever they gave to them. And I can give you a perfect example. A couple years ago, when I was still in the city of St. Louis, there was a St. Charles attorney who was taking money from one of his clients. And because all the judges and the prosecutors in St. Charles County knew him, they asked us to review it. And we reviewed and talked to everyone, because by the time it came to us, that elderly couple had passed on. And in uncovering their financial records and everything else, that elderly couple had given this attorney had given him a power of attorney in order to transfer all of their accounts. They wanted to consolidate because they didn't have any kids, they had a lot of money, they had different bank accounts, and they had given this attorney the power of attorney over them to do all of that. And in lieu of that, he charged them a huge amount of money. And then, what the husband had passed, and mom was in a nursing home and not knowing what he was doing, he started going to ATMs all across St. Charles and taking out $15,000 in cash, $20,000 in cash, to the tune of $400,000 of this couple's money. And nobody was there to object to it because they didn't have any kids. Nobody was paying attention until the nursing home wasn't paying. He stopped paying the nursing home bills, so they started objecting. They called in the Division of Aging. They started paying attention. By the time it came to us, wife had passed on. So we didn't have the two people that we needed to either prove that they did not have the capacity to revoke his power of attorney. They never gave him permission to take this money out to go gambling, but we couldn't because they were no longer alive. So I got creative and I called the IRS, which was all we could do because we couldn't prove the state crime, but I knew for a fact he didn't report that money on his taxes, so I called the IRS. So we get creative, but sometimes we're not going to be able to charge the crime that could have occurred, that did occur, because of facts and circumstances that have occurred in the meantime. They're difficult to prove because a lot of times your mom or your dad won't admit that they don't have the capacity to consent. So if we have to go to trial on it and mom and dad are still around with us and they haven't been declared incompetent by a judge, but you're mad because a caregiver they gave the caregiver money, excuse me, we gotta put mom and dad up on the stand, or somehow a doctor, someone proved that at the time they gave that money, they were not able to consent, that they did not do it of their own free will and volition, and that they were taking advantage of because of their age. So they're difficult cases to prove, which is why it's good to be aware of the circumstances, the risk factors, the signs and warning signals. But that is not, even if it's difficult to prove on the back end, we always want you to report it, though, any situations like that, because you never know how we can prove it and what we can do. And then also, there's civil remedies that can assist you. So Vaughn can talk to you about those. I'm not here to talk about those today, but on the criminal side.
I just want to throw out one more.
Okay.
Because this comes up a lot, and I don't know why there isn't a company that watches the house of the deceased when there's a funeral, but probably 50 times a year somebody calls me with an outraged story and I'll use this one as an example, my selfish, and this was an actual email, my selfish, greedy, horrible sister shows up on the day of mom's funeral, the first time we've seen her in years, and she has the gall to drive up in mom's van, which is loaded down with stuff she obviously took from mom's house. Mom has a will, it's not in court yet, but she would have left that stuff to my sister anyway, but for Pete's sake, what can we do? Is this a crime? Can she go to jail?
Well, essentially, it's a gray area because I guess at the moment that she took the stuff, was she stealing? Did she know the stuff was hers? Does she have a copy of the will? Does everyone have a copy of the will? Is the stuff she took exactly what was in the will? Did she know it ahead of time? Did the person communicate it? So those are the things that I would ask before I would make a charging decision. If the answers to that are no, the will was buried, nobody knew what was in it, then yeah, she'd be stealing because she wasn't aware that she had permission, and until the will was actually probated, that permission was not official. So essentially, the defense would be that she would have gotten the stuff anyway, and she probably would, because my guess is at the end of that case, whether it was a conviction or not, she'd probably show up and say, give me my stuff back. There's a will that says it's hers, so what are you gonna do? I mean, it's one of those gray areas that it could be a crime in the sense that the actual consent had not been conveyed. I'm going to go out on a limb here and just say it's going to be a case-by-case basis. It's those intervening facts that we as prosecutors want to ask in each individual situation is what turns what we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So if stealing is that you have to appropriate the property of another without that person's permission with the intent to deprive that person thereof. So her intent probably couldn't prove that, because if that person's dead, we can't prove that she was trying to deprive that person of it. She might have been trying to deprive her siblings of it, but that's a whole other issue too. So that turns on some more facts that I would need to know about.
Thank you, I'm gonna stop.
Are you sure?
No, what do you mean, Vaughn? There's like 4 more here.
There are, but I see we're getting close on time.
Okay. Well, does anyone else here have any questions? Okay. All right, well, if we're close on time, I'll be happy to sit down.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.